Hi, I'm Matt Harris. Seton Tucker and I host the podcast Impact of Influence, which for 2 years covered in depth Alec Murdaugh, who was eventually convicted in 2023 of murdering his wife Maggie and son Paul. That story continues to evolve, and we will cover that. Plus, we will tell you stories of other true crime events that have happened in the South. Please join us on Impact of Influence. And give us a follow on the Impact of Influence Facebook page.
Sometime in the early 80s, REO Speedwagon's airplane made an unannounced, middle-of-the-night landing.
This is my friend Kyle MacLachlan, the star of Twin Peaks. And he's telling me about how he discovered a real-life Twin Peaks in rural North Carolina, not far from where he filmed Blue Velvet.
What was on the plane was copious amounts of drugs coming in from South America. Supposedly, Pablo Escobar went looking for other spots, quiet, out-of-the-way places to bring in his cocaine.
My name is Joshua Davis, and I'm an investigative reporter. Kyle and I talk all the time about the strange things we come across, but nothing was quite as strange as what we found in Varnamtown, North Carolina.
There's crooked cops, brother against brother. Everyone's got a story to tell, but does the truth even exist? Welcome to Varnamtown.
Varnamtown is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
On our first trip to Manteca, Susan and I found ourselves in an interview we hadn't expected. We were talking to Victoria, who is the mother of Jake's friend Louis. When she found out from Louis that we were in town looking into the murder of Renee Ramos, Victoria asked to meet with us.
Can you tell us why you want to talk to us today?
Yes, because for a very long time I've believed that this person is guilty. He was like part of the family, even though he's practically let me know that he did it.
Can I ask who this is?
It's Tim Fisher.
Tim Fisher is Louis's brother, not by blood or adoption, but family just the same. And Louis's mother believes Tim committed the murder that Louis's friend is serving life in prison for.
I'm Susan Simpson.
And I'm Jacinda Davis.
I'm an attorney and investigator.
And I'm a true crime TV producer.
And this is Proof, Season 2, Murder at the Warehouse. Proof is a Red Marble Media production in association with Glassbox Media.
New episodes are released on Mondays, and on Thursdays you can catch our sidebar episodes where we talk about the case, talk to guests, and tell you more about what's going on behind the scenes. You can find additional materials about this case on our website at proofcrimepod.com.
This is Episode 10, The Search for Rapper's Delight.
I've known Tim since he was a teen or preteen, and he's always been involved with our family. The kids brought him home one day. He just became like part of the family. He called me Mom.
Victoria told us that she'd fed Tim dinner one night, and after that, he kind of just never left. Tim was about the same age as Victoria's older son, Bobby, and 10 years older than her younger son, Louis. He was close with both her boys. So Victoria knows Tim very well, and has for a long time. But before Renee's murder, she hadn't even known about Louis's friend Jake.
Did you know Jake at all?
No, I met Jake the day after her body was found. Jake was at my house the next day, and so the detectives were coming and going at my house.
Detectives began swarming around Victoria's house. That's what it felt like to her anyway. They were there constantly, trying to talk to Louis about Jake. Victoria was alarmed. With all these detectives showing such intense interest in her son, She'd felt compelled to do something she'd never done before. When Lewis got a phone call, she'd picked up the other line. She wanted to know what either Jake or the detectives were telling her son. But it wasn't Jake calling, and it wasn't the detectives either.
Tim had called Lewis. And normally I don't listen in, my kids, that's private, but with all this going on, I said, I want to hear what this guy's saying. I have never in my life felt so much hatred for women. And I've known a lot of men that don't like women. I never felt anything like it. It was just like to the core. I couldn't believe it. It was extreme going on and on to Lewis about this just ungodly hatred for women.
Victoria doesn't remember exactly what Tim said on that call. It hadn't been about Renee, but his comments about women had turned her stomach. Not long after that, Victoria started hearing people around town suggest that maybe Tim had been involved in some way with what had happened to Renee.
Tim had wrote, this is after she was found, Tim wrote bitch killer on a skateboard. And whoever's around there is asking him, Tim, did you do it? And stuff like that. And he never denied it. He never denied it. And so that's what first threw me.
What Victoria heard about Tim's activities in the days and weeks after Renee's body was found had concerned her, as had the fact of where Renee's body had been found, because the Home Depot was very close to where Tim could usually be found.
He was living in Lovell Court, you think?
The bushes in the back of the court is where he was living. He was homeless. Guy in a skateboard into meth.
Perhaps most alarming of all, though, was that Victoria began hearing people claim they'd seen Tim and Renee together shortly before her body was found.
I was told, like talk on the street and everything, that he was with her. Right during the time period of her murder, he was with her at his mother's house in Escalon.
Victoria's concerns about Tim weren't based on any one thing. But to her, it felt like this collection of rumors and coincidences just kept piling up. And it began to create a picture in her mind of what could have happened.
When I find out how she died, and I know Tim's living right there, and I hear that Tim was seen with her, that he took her to his mother's house, and that she was walking down Yosemite Avenue toward right where he was. And so maybe Tim, with all his charms, said, come on, let's go to my mom's house, let's get something to eat or whatever. He can really, as odd as it seems, like just charm some women. Pete Davidson, no.
We understood why all of this might have made Victoria wonder. Is it possibly concerning? Sure. But is it evidence of murder? No, not really. Most of what Victoria knew was just rumor combined with coincidence of Renee's body being found near to where Tim was living. Victoria knew this too, which is why she never called the police to tell them about it. If the story had ended there, Victoria might have gotten over it and forgotten her suspicions in time. But then Tim did something that, in her mind, might as well have been an admission of guilt. Tim left.
And he disappeared for years. No contact with family or friends. He just disappeared.
So you remember that he took off soon after Renee was found murdered?
Uh-huh. And like I said, we were like family. He didn't contact us. He didn't contact my sons, which are like brothers. He didn't contact any of his friends.
Our interview with Victoria caught Susan and I off guard. We hadn't known what to expect when she asked to talk to us, but we definitely hadn't expected this. When she said Tim Fisher's name, though, Susan had recognized it instantly.
There were other people reporting Tim Fisher.
Really?
Yeah.
Is Tim Fisher the one who is connected to the sisters?
Yes.
And the backpack? And
The story about that, yeah.
Tim Fisher's name is scattered throughout the case file. But the very first person to talk about him that we know of was Eric Greer. That's the man who recorded the video statement in the park about the sister story and how Renee had been killed in the sister's house on Pestana Avenue. Eric thought he might know who had killed her, too.
You had mentioned a gentleman by the name of Tim Fisher.
Yeah, Tim Fisher. He's the one that a lot of people thought was the one who did it.
Describe what Tim Fisher looks like.
He's tall, very tall, lanky. He used to drive a little Datsun 510.
Okay.
A few weeks after Renee's body was found, Eric Greer called the police and told them the story about the sister's house. We don't know exactly what he said. From what we can tell, the detectives didn't record the interview, and the reports don't go into any detail about it. They just note that Eric told them his friend Liam, who at the time was the boyfriend of the older sister, had told Eric it was Tim Fisher who'd committed the crime. Eric Greer wasn't the only witness to mention Tim. Victoria never spoke to the police about him, but other people did, and either suggested Tim could be a suspect or outright accused him of the murder. One of those tips came in from a woman identified only as Jenny, husband is a friend of Tim Fisher. Here's Kevin reading the tip sheet.
Tim Fisher, 27 years, tall, thin, was with Renee 2 days before murder. Gets nervous when Renee is mentioned. Has prior for hating women, and as mentioned, knows Renee before.
This tip had not been anonymous. Jenny had given her first name and her phone number, but the detectives never followed up with her. The detectives did follow up on this tip in other ways, though. We don't know how exactly. The files don't specify that. But there's a note confirming that the detectives did look into Tim, at least a little. Here's the complete report.
Numerous subjects, including Fisher, contacted in person and via phone.
There's no record that we can find of what Tim Fisher told the detectives, or who the other subjects they spoke to might have been. And from reading through these reports, you get the impression the detectives didn't take any of the leads about Tim too seriously, because they checked into them, found nothing of interest, and moved on.
A few years after Ty and Jake were convicted, a chance encounter brought Victoria and her family back into contact with Tim Fisher.
Just by chance, my husband's parents bought a house outside of Modesto. So we were leaving their house one day, and I said, "Bob, that's Tim," and he's riding on a bike with a little kid. So we talked, he acted like nothing happened, invited us over to him and his, I don't know if they were married yet, but Amber's house. Big, nice, beautiful home. And all of a sudden, everything was back on again.
Victoria and her sons picked up with Tim again like he'd never been gone at all. Tim seemed to be doing well now, too. In Manteca, he'd been on the streets, but now he had a family and a house down near Modesto. Victoria also got to know Tim's partner, Amber, who, just by the way, is an entirely different person from Renee's friend, Amber.
And when she became more comfortable with me, she would start bringing up 2 or 3 times the topic of how Tim liked to choke her out during sex. And she was kind of afraid that it was going to go too far or whatever, because he was so bad at it. Every once in a while I'd go over there and us 3 only would be there making strawberry daiquiris. And one night we're having them, and his wife says out of the blue, "Yeah, Tim even got away with murder." And I was just stunned, and I didn't say anything. I didn't even respond to it. And it just passed by. But that's what his wife had said.
For a long time, Victoria shoved her doubts about Tim aside. But those doubts started to come back, until finally she decided to say something.
Time went by. We're sitting on the couch like right next to each other one day, and I looked at him eye to eye. And I said, I know what you did. And it was like a deer in the headlights. So I said, I know what you did. And he said, you mean like what you did last summer, that movie? And I said, yeah, like that. Then it just dropped and life went on. But in that moment is when I was sure in my heart that he did it.
Knowing something in your heart is one thing, but having evidence to prove it is another thing entirely. Victoria knew that if Tim really had been involved in Renee's death somehow, there'd need to be evidence of it. So she decided to get some.
I just walked in the living room. He was talking. I went behind his chair. I just didn't say a word, pulled his hair up, cut a piece off. What are you doing? I said, oh, I just get hair from people I love. That's what I do. He goes, are you trying to get my DNA? And I kind of, I didn't really say anything. Maybe, maybe not. That was my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Do you think you have that hair anywhere?
Yeah, I still have it.
We could see why Victoria might be suspicious of Tim, but nothing she told us was really evidence of anything. She knew nothing that could answer the question of how and why Renee and Tim could have ended up together before she went missing.
So why do you think that Renee went with Tim Fisher after she went missing?
I don't know. I later found out she was walking up Yosemite right toward that area, and that's where Tim was living. They could have just bumped into each other.
Maybe. It's certainly possible Renee could have bumped into Tim, but Renee could have bumped into basically anyone in Manteca. And nothing in the case indicated that Renee and Tim could have possibly known one another. Yes, Tim was Lewis's brother, and Lewis was friends with Jake and Renee, but they never hung out with Tim together. If Renee had a connection to Tim, it wasn't through Lewis. We're confident of that.
Listen to the 48 Hours podcast for shocking murder cases and compelling real-life dramas from one of television's most watched true crime shows. Go behind the scenes of each episode with award-winning CBS News correspondents and producers in Postmortem, a weekly deep dive. Listen to 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts.
True terrors of horror, bizarre happenings, unexplainable events. On our podcast, Disturbed, terror takes center stage. Each episode is a journey into the darkest corners of human existence, delving into bone-chilling tales of kidnappings, serial killers, maniacs, and the very essence of your worst nightmares coming to life on this weekly true horror show. Disturbed is not for the faint of heart. It's an exploration of real, unadulterated horror sourced from everyday people. Each episode is a descent into the macabre, where we narrate stories that will leave you on the edge of your seat and crawling in your skin. We navigate the disturbing narratives that lurk in the shadows, offering a raw and unfiltered listen into the most terrifying aspects of the human experience. Enter at your own risk and let the unsettling tales unfold in the haunting realm of Disturbed. And remember, listeners, stay safe out there.
New England is known for its charming towns, comforting foods, and of course its historical contributions, but the Down East region can have a dark side. I'm investigative journalist Kylie Lowe, and on my weekly podcast, Dark Down East, I dig into both decades-old and modern-day cases from my home state of Maine and the greater New England area. In each episode of Dark Down East, I seek insight from law enforcement officials, family members, and other loved ones who are both deeply familiar with the cases and the individuals at the heart of them. Join me as I unveil intricacies of these stories that are often overlooked, honor the grit of those searching for justice, and shine a light on cases that you aren't hearing on other podcasts. Listen to Dark Down East now, wherever you're listening.
Lewis knew we'd spoken to his mother. He was not surprised when, afterwards, we were interested in learning more about Tim. But as you might imagine, this is a complicated situation for Lewis. And when we recorded our interview with him, he did not speak much about Tim, beyond mentioning him in passing. It seems like this town of the kids were a big age range would hang out.
Yeah, no, for sure, because I'm the youngest of three boys. One's only by blood, but so two older brothers, Bobby and Tim. And they're 10 and 11 years older than me.
There was something Lewis mentioned, though, that we recognized as potentially significant. But you remember reading something about...
Yeah, about police are looking for a suspect with the size, I believe it was 13 or 14 Vans shoe at the time, but now all those papers for 2 months are missing.
But in your memory, there was an article that came out.
Yeah, there was. And
we're looking for...
Not just my memory.
Lewis is certain that not long after Renee was found, he'd seen in the news that police found a size 13 or 14 Vans shoe print at the crime scene. We don't know if he's right about this or not. Like Lewis mentioned, all the newspaper articles from Manteca's local paper, the Bulletin, are missing for the time period around the murder. The Bulletin had given all of its old editions to the local library in microfiche form, but somehow those rolls for May, June, and July of 2000 got lost. This article about the shoe prints, if it exists, is something we've never been able to find. We know that there were shoe prints found around Renee's body. At least 5 are documented. But we don't know anything about what those shoe prints looked like or where exactly they were located. So if there really were size 13 or 14 Vans shoe prints found at the crime scene, as of now, only the Manteca Police Department would know that. But I would guess that typically the construction workers aren't wearing Vans.
No, they're boots.
So if they had a size 13 Vans walking around the crime scene, that would stand out.
You'd think, yeah. Especially at 13 Vans, it's a pretty long foot.
Lewis didn't say it, but I thought I knew what he might be thinking. Tim Fisher is a very tall man. He was also a skateboarder and liked Vans. So if there had been a size 13 or 14 Vans shoe print left near Renee's body, well, there can't have been too many people in Manteca who could have left it there. After our interview with Victoria, Jacinda and I weren't sure what to make of it. What were the sources of these rumors that Victoria had heard? And why, before her, had Eric Greer linked Tim Fisher to the sisters' story?
I mean, it's so far-fetched, but maybe we can't just discredit it.
Yeah, it's kind of tempting because it just seems like a bunch of craziness, but...
Yeah.
Looking back now, it's funny to hear this conversation and hear how Jacinda and I had reacted at the time. There was so much we didn't know. But I think one reason we were so skeptical is that these accusations against Tim Fisher were nothing new. Most of what Victoria told us had been reported to the police by other people back during the original investigation. From the files, it doesn't seem like detectives investigated it extensively, but they'd at least glanced at it before moving on. And the defense attorneys had these reports too. None of this was any kind of secret. So if the sister's story had any validity to it, then someone would have already figured that out by now, right? Well, the sisters, one of them at least is still in Manteca.
Let's try to find her.
At least get some kind of answers about what the heck's going on with that.
Yeah. All right. And are we gonna, I guess we try to find Tim Fisher.
Let's try and find the sisters first.
Oh boy.
It's Probably nothing, but we gotta rule it out. We would eventually speak to Tim Fisher and to one of the sisters. Both denied that they had been involved in Renee's murder. What we learned from them, though, meant that our investigation into the house on Pastana Avenue would not end there.
As far as we know, Detective Sousa and Wells did not speak to anyone connected to the sister story. None of their records reference it. It was other officers who'd followed up on those leads. But Sousa and Wells knew about the sister story, for sure, because the transcripts from their interviews with Jake and his friends show that they asked about it all the time. One thing the detectives were trying to figure out was whether Renee had known anyone who lived in an out-of-the-way neighborhood behind the racquetball club over on Pastana Avenue. They were trying to figure out if Renee had ever hung out around the sister's house. In one interrogation, they quizzed Jake about it.
Did you guys have any friends over on the east side of town, over behind the, that little club over there where you can work out?
Past the freeway on Yosemite, past 99.
Did you know anybody that lived out that way, over there? Did you ever go visit anybody or know of anybody that lived out there?
I think she might have had a friend out there, I can't remember. I never really went out there with her.
Jake told the detectives he thought Renee went out that way, sometimes, but he didn't know why. None of his friends lived out that way.
We know Detectives Sousa and Wells had some kind of interest in Tim Fisher as well, because they asked Jake about him a few different times.
So this Tim, now Lewis is a friend of yours, right? Lewis, and then Tim is his brother. And why do they call him Tall Tim? Is he tall, or is that just a nickname?
He's tall.
In one interrogation, Jake told the detectives that his friend Lewis had recently given him an update about Tim.
Lewis told me he's running from the cops.
Running from the cops?
Lewis just says he's running from the cops. Is it this thing with Renee?
I guess.
But people were making threats to him of possibly being involved with the death of Renee, right?
That's what he was saying.
The detectives asked Jake, "What is Tim Fisher like? What kind of person is he?"
Is he kind of a weird guy?
No.
He's strange, or is he normal?
He's goofy. He's a goofy guy.
Well, what would tie him in with this? Kind of certain. I mean, if he's running from the cops, because he thinks he's involved.
No, he's in Stockton.
He's in Stockton.
If Tim is running from the cops because he thinks he's involved, it's kind of important, Detective Wells tells Jake. But Jake doesn't know anything more about it, other than that maybe Tim is hiding out in Stockton. In interviews with Jake and his friends, many of the questions that Detective Sousa and Wells ask seem to have been based on one of the reports that came in about Tim Fisher. It was from a witness who'd contacted them with some secondhand information. Here's Kevin, reading what the report says.
The murder took place in the garage of a home located behind the racquetball court at Pastana. There were 4 people present during the murder, including a subject by the name of Tall Tim and the suspected murderer, possible ex-boyfriend of Renee, Richard. Renee would not have sex with Richard, and a fight ensued. Richard is supposed to go by the nickname Rapper's Delight.
Based on their interrogations of Jake Silva, Detectives Sousa and Wells seem to have believed that Rapper's Delight might be connected to Jake somehow.
Anybody with a nickname like Rapster or Rapper's Delight or anything like that? Nicknames of
Isn't that the Sugar Hill Gang? Isn't that
I think so. Whose nickname is that? Is that Rocky's?
Jake told them it definitely wasn't his friend Robbie Mendoza. He'd never heard about anyone named Rapper's Delight at all. But what about this guy Richard? Did Jake know him? The audio isn't great, but you can hear them ask Jake, did Renee ever have a boyfriend named Richard?
She ever have a boyfriend named Richard? No, but she was messed around with a guy named Richard. And when did she date this guy? She didn't really date him. She met him at a party.
So, maybe part of the sister story is true after all. Maybe Renee really did have an ex-boyfriend, or at least an ex-fleeing named Richard. But detectives never figured out who this Richard was. We would ask Jake to tell us more about him. But, well, Jake can't help us with any of that now. He no longer remembers any guy named Richard that Renee ever had a fling with. And none of Renee's friends remember Richard either. So he remains a mystery.
This police report about Renee being killed by Tim Fisher and Renee's ex Richard, aka Rapper Delight, is never mentioned at trial. But it ends up playing a pivotal role in this case, just not in the way you might expect. Because Sousa and Wells kept asking around about Rapper's Delight, until finally they found Josh Burrows and asked him about it.
You ever hear the name Rapster? Or Rapper Delight?
I think it was Richard. I knew he had an obsession with Renee.
Josh Burrows told detectives that Rapper's Delight is actually Richard Ornelas. And it was Richard Ornelas who took Josh Burrows to the party at the Home Depot.
You and Richard were kind of palling around that day. And then you guys go to Home Depot. And then you meet Jake, Renee, Ray Gunn, and Robbie Mendoza, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Josh Burrows hadn't actually known Richard Ornelas' last name, but he was able to give them some identifying details, including the name of Richard's best friend.
And, you know Lito? He's Lito's friend.
I've kicked it with Richard and Lito. Richard and Lito, were they there when she was strangled?
I don't know about Lito. Richard was there, yeah, because I was with him.
He was watching it too?
I think so.
Richard Ornelas declined to speak to us for the podcast, but we were able to talk to his friend Lito. And Josh Burrows was right about at least one thing. Lito was indeed good friends with Richard Ornelas. Though that's the only thing that Josh Burrows got right about Richard.
He called him Rapper Delight?
Yeah.
So Richard Ornelas, I don't know where the hell he got that. I think he was pulling shit out of his ass. I'm sorry.
And you are very confident that he's never been Rapper's Delight.
Oh yes, 100% confident, yes.
According to Lito, he and Richard Ornelas were close. They hung out all the time. But neither of them ever hung out with Josh Burrows. We showed Lito what Josh Burrows had told police about him and Richard.
He claims that Rapper Delight, aka Richard, is obsessed with Renee.
Yeah, that was never a thing either.
Okay, so he never had an interest in Renee whatsoever?
No, hell no. His girlfriend would never have had that.
Lito told us he had no idea why Josh Burrows would have said any of those things. He never knew Burrows mentioned him at all. The detectives never spoke to him about it. But Lito told us that the police had interrogated Richard Ornelas.
He called me and he was scared shitless about the whole situation. His mom got a lawyer. They were very upset.
Detectives did question Richard Ornelas twice, but they didn't document it. Not at the time, anyway. It was not until 2002, just before Ty's trial began, that Detective Ken Wells belatedly wrote a short 2-paragraph summary of the interviews he'd conducted with Richard Ornelas back in 2000.
Here's the only report we have. On October 24th, Richard Ornelas talked to us for an hour and denied having any information about the homicide, denied ever being at the Home Depot. It should be noted that this interview was videotaped, however, we've lost the tape.
Of course they did.
Figures. In his report, Detective Wells explained that although these interviews with Richard Ornelas took place in 2000, they were not documented in any police report until 2002. That's because the police lost the videotape of Ornelas' second interview. And somehow, because of that, they overlooked documenting either interview. That's a weird explanation, but it's not hard to see why Susan Wells might have wanted to forget what Richard Ornelas told them. Because their entire case was based on Josh Burrows' story about the Home Depot party. And Josh Burrows said that the entire reason he was at the party was because of Richard Ornelas. But when the detectives spoke to Richard Ornelas for themselves, he told them that everything Josh said was a lie. Richard Ornelas had never been to the Home Depot. He'd never partied with Josh Burrows. None of it was true. For some reason, the detectives did not document any of this. They did not record the fact that Richard Ornelas had refuted their star witness's entire story. It was not until over a year later, in 2002, just before the start of Ty's scheduled trial, that they recalled it again and finally wrote a brief report. It is concerning that detectives failed to document exculpatory interviews. But we don't know exactly what happened here because Detective Susan Wells did not respond to our request to speak to them for the podcast.
We have not found a shred of evidence that Richard Ornelas had anything to do with the Home Depot or Renee's murder. Josh Burrows' story has no connection to reality. So where did this whole story come from then? As we left our interview with Lito, Susan explained what she now thought had happened.
My new theory about what happened was that the cops keep talking about Richard Rapper's Delight. I think they'd already asked Josh Burrows about it. Do you know Rapper's Delight? Richard. And they don't know a last name, so they don't have a last name to give. I think our buddy Josh Burrows hears this and immediately goes, the only Richard I know is Richard Ornelas. Let's claim he's Rapper's Delight. Richard Ornelas is good friends with Lito, so let's add him to the story too.
Yeah.
Josh Burrows' story about how he was invited to the Home Depot party by a guy named Rapper's Delight seems to have been nothing more than Josh parroting back a name that he'd been told by Detective Susan Wells. In short, the story that was used to convict Jake Silva and Ty Lopes of Renee's murder had its origins in a police report that identified Tim Fisher as the actual killer, and had nothing to do with Jake or Ty. Or at least it hadn't been about them until Josh Burrows came up with a story to make it so. We've spent a lot of time trying to find Renee's ex, Richard. We believe he did exist, but today, none of Renee's girlfriends can recall him. In fact, we've only ever found one person in Manteca who thinks that they maybe remember Renee mentioning this Richard guy before. And he's not even certain about that at all. What about Richard? She had an ex named Richard. We don't know what his last name was.
Oh, no, I think he might have been from Ripon. She mentioned something about a boyfriend or something she used to have that lived by her dad in Ripon, I believe.
And Richard sounds like the right name?
It sounds like, yeah.
That's Josh Matthews. He first met Renee in 1998 when she was 16.
Can you tell us how you knew Renee?
We dated, actually.
Although they were dating, Renee had been keeping a secret from Josh.
When did you find out that she'd been cheating on Jake with you?
Not till after she died.
Josh Matthews and Renee first started dating in 1998, long before Renee ever met Jake Silva.
How'd you meet her? Were y'all at a party or?
I think we were at an orchard.
The orchards were the usual party location for Manteca's teenagers. And one night, Josh and Renee had both been at the same orchard party.
And what'd you think when you met Renee?
Actually, I didn't really think too much of it. She asked me for a ride home, so I gave her a ride home, and then we hit it off.
So that was kind of her way of making a move?
Yeah. She was very forward that way.
She was cute.
She was cute. That's why I was kind of dumbfounded when she did. It's not normal for,
So you didn't think you had a chance, or?
Yeah, I just didn't ever really think that was an option for me, I guess.
How long did y'all date for?
About 6 months.
Was it a good relationship, bad relationship?
It was good. I didn't really get to see her a lot. I had just started a new job, and I was working like 12, 14-hour days, so I didn't get to do a whole lot.
Did she break up with you, or?
Yeah, just because I wasn't around enough, I guess.
Josh Matthews told us that Renee had seemed frustrated with him for not being available much of the time, and so they'd split up, but left it on good terms. We wondered, though, if maybe this was one of the reasons Renee had been so drawn to Jake. He was someone who could be around her all the time.
I feel like she went to the opposite. The guy who's working 14-hour days, the guy who's working 0-hour days.
Yeah, well, from what I understand, she dated him before she dated me, and then after we broke up, she went back to him. That's what I was told. I didn't know him.
The timeline here is a bit messy, but Josh Matthews and Renee actually dated first. Then Renee started dating another guy, and later on, after that, decided to start dating Jake. Then, in December of 1999, Jake went to Oregon for a few months to try living with his mom, and while he was gone, Renee and Josh Matthews bumped into each other at a house party.
So when you ran into Renee again, did you know that she and Jake were still together?
No.
She didn't tell you?
Even her mom never said anything either.
I think they all want her to dump Jake, so I don't think they...
That's kind of what I put together.
We know Renee had a few flings while Jake was gone, but as far as we're aware, Josh Matthews was the only guy she was actually dating. When Jake ended up moving back to Manteca, Renee broke up with Josh Matthews for the final time and resumed her relationship with Jake.
There's no indication that Renee and Josh Matthews ever had any contact after they broke up for the second time. And the detectives did look into him. He was pretty much the only guy from Renee's past that they did talk to. And he was always cooperative and open with them. But Josh Matthews made us realize that maybe we needed to revisit some of our assumptions about this case. Because one of the reasons we'd been skeptical of the sister story is that we couldn't understand how Renee would have ever ended up at the sister's house. Pastana Avenue was cut off from the rest of Manteca by Highway 99, and it's not a place you just happen to pass by on your way somewhere else. The only real reason that Renee would have ended up out there is if she was specifically going to see someone out there. And we thought Renee hadn't known anyone who lived in that area. But we were wrong. She'd known at least one person there. Where were you living when this happened?
I lived out behind the gym off Pastana.
Right. Did you know any of your neighbors there?
And most of them.
Jamie and Julie? They lived on Pastana in the corner there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Josh Matthews had lived directly across the street from the sister's house, where Eric Greer said Renee had been killed. Josh Matthews was not part of that group and not connected to the sister's story. But still, just a few months before she died, Renee had been dating a guy who lived right across the street from the sister's house. So maybe the idea that Renee could have been hanging out with people over on Pastana Avenue wasn't so far-fetched after all.
During our first trip to Manteca, Susan and I realized we were going to have to look a lot harder into the sister story. There was a lot there we needed to figure out, but we were also interested in finding out more about Jared Conway, the serial sex offender that someone had accused online, anonymously, of killing Renee. After learning more about him, Susan explained to Jake that there was a new potential lead we were working on.
I mean, I don't know anything yet, but there's definitely a lot of reasons I'm curious about him. And what I do know now is that, when he got arrested for the last time, while in jail, he confessed to a murder in Tennessee.
What the fuck? He confessed to it and still... What the fuck?
He confessed in jail.
And they never even followed up on it?
I don't know what happened.
We checked records in Tennessee and found no indication that Conway had ever been charged with the homicide there. But we had been able to get court records from Modesto, California, for Conway's 2008 conviction for kidnapping a 14-year-old girl. And in one of the prosecutor's filings, she noted that, while in jail, Conway had confessed to killing a female victim in 2007. And we know from media reports that at Conway's sentencing hearing, The prosecutor has specified that Conway had committed this murder in Tennessee. But that's all we knew. Our requests to the police department and the DA's office for further records on Conway were all denied. So we had no idea who Conway's female victim had been.
We got denied the files, so we can't see what the actual records are. And Stanislaw doesn't keep, there's no transcripts for sentencing.
Isn't it public information?
California is the worst. They don't give you anything.
I already know, trust me.
Yeah.
I'm a perfect example of it.
So the records we have on Jared Conway were limited. But we were trying to figure out how accurate that comment had been from the anonymous user on the Ghost Sightings webpage. How much had this person really known about Conway? Were the other claims they made about him accurate? One thing the anonymous user said that we weren't sure about was that when Renee disappeared, Jared Conway had been living in Manteca, behind the Indy's car wash. Initially, it seemed like Mr. Anonymous had gotten this one wrong. Conway was from Modesto. Most of his time in California, he'd lived down there. But Jared did have some connections to Manteca. His brother Jeremy had owned the Indy's car wash right across the street from the Home Depot. And then, from checking court records, we saw that Jared Conway had been arrested on July 7th, 2000. So, just a month after Renee's body was found. Conway had been charged with driving while under the influence of methamphetamines. We requested a copy of the case file from the court to see what Conway's home address had been listed as in the paperwork there.
It turned out that the anonymous user on strangeusa.com was right. Jared Conway had been living in Manteca around the time of Renee's disappearance. Conway's home address was listed as a residence in Manteca around the corner from Ashwood Court, where Renee's family lived. Susan gave Jake an update.
You said he was in Manteca at the time?
He was living on Flores, which is kind of near Ashwood.
He might have worked at McDonald's with her.
He worked at Indy's, and there's nothing in between Indy's and McDonald's.
Wow, this shit just keeps getting deeper, weirder, wow. I just got goosebumps, really bad.
I would love to rule him out, but we can't so far.
We had no idea who had written the anonymous comment on the Ghost Sightings page, but whoever it was had clearly known Jared Conway. Everything they'd said about him that we could fact check turned out to be true. The brother who owned the car wash died in 2008, so we couldn't talk to him. But we did find another one of Jared's brothers, one who had never lived in Manteca, and we were able to speak to him.
My brother didn't know too much, but it was still interesting. He just said his brother was a monster, so he always stayed away. But he knew some about the timeline.
Does it fit? Does the timeline fit?
It's complicated. There's a lot going on with that. From what I know so far, yeah.
We'd started looking at the whole Jared Conway thing with the goal of ruling him out, of finding something that would show he had no connection to anything. But at least so far, all our attempts to rule him out had failed. We had to keep looking.
Hi, listeners. I'm Vanessa Richardson, host of the podcast Serial Killers. Like many of you, I'm fascinated by the darker side of humanity. What causes someone to develop such deadly desires and why they decide to act on them? For the past 6 years, I've been able to explore these curiosities weekly, tapping into the mental states of the world's most notorious killers, examining their backgrounds and habits, searching for answers. If you haven't had a chance to check out our show, there's truly no better time to dive in. With hundreds of episodes to binge and new ones released weekly, Serial Killers is the perfect podcast for any avid true crime fan. Follow Serial Killers on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts.
From DNA testing to the Dixie Mafia, Crime Capsule brings you new stories of true crime in American history. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Join us for exclusive interviews with authors from Arcadia Publishing, writing the hottest books on the most chilling stories of our country's past. You can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts or on evergreenpodcasts.com. Crime Capsule. History so interesting, it's criminal.
Hey everyone, before we continue with this episode, I want to tell you about another podcast. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to watch your house burn down or be attacked by an alligator or learn that your spouse hired someone to kill you? If you're dying to know, then What Was That Like is the podcast for you. What Was That Like is filled with real stories about the most surreal experiences of people's lives. On the show, host Scott Johnson dives deep with his guests into the unbelievable situations they found themselves in, like animal attacks, plane crashes, winning the Price is Right, and more. The show brings you tons of completely surreal, completely true stories, all told through the lens of the person who actually experienced it.
Check out some of these episodes about wild and gripping stories to gain some insight on what it was like to, say, be a professional bridesmaid or lose a leg in a shark attack.
Susan, I think you'd be a really good professional bridesmaid.
And you'd be really good at losing a leg in a shark attack.
Oh, gee, thanks.
So if you want to hear some disturbing and inspiring firsthand stories, you need to check out What Was That Like? Every story is thoroughly researched and fact-checked, so you know even the most bizarre tales are someone's reality. Listen to What Was That Like on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. On our trips to Manteca, another thing we'd wanted to do was to go see the Home Depot. We brought copies of Josh Burrows' crime scene sketches with us, the ones he'd drawn for detectives during his interrogations. So now we have Burrows' various artistic renderings. Drawing 2 is one he did in a later interview when he's saying that this whole Home Depot murder occurred.
So basically it's a small rectangle.
Josh Burrows had drawn a big box to represent the Home Depot. Then he'd marked the spot where Renee's body was left, or rather the spots, plural. These 2 circles, this is where Josh says that the body was. It's either here or there.
Well, isn't that convenient?
I know.
It's either on the right side of the store or the left side of the store. And it's a 50-50 chance it's on the right or left. I mean, okay. It's like playing roulette, black or red.
He's covered his bases.
Yeah.
In a later interview, in marking where Renee's body was found, he'd circled the northwest, southwest, and southeast corners. And then, in yet a later interview, the same rectangle was drawn again, and this time, Josh marked it in the northwest corner, the southwest corner, and pretty much in the center of the warehouse. So yeah, Josh tried to cover his bases, but it didn't work. Renee was found just a few feet from the building's south wall, but almost exactly in the middle. Nowhere near any of the marks on Josh's mini diagrams. So we didn't really need to go to the Home Depot to realize that Josh Burrows had no idea where Renee was found. His drawings alone make that clear. But some of the crime scene photos we had were harder to interpret. And while in Manteca's Home Depot, we tried to figure out where the various crime scene photos had been taken. You know, now that I'm looking at it, I don't think we have that angle over there. That back.
We need to bring the laptop with us.
Just awkwardly sit here with our crime scene laptop.
We could be designing our kitchen.
Yeah, makes total sense. We're a lesbian couple here getting a new kitchen redo and just making sure it matches up with what we wanted. We did not open crime scene photos in the Home Depot. But we did awkwardly walk around with our microphones, trying to get a feel for the building's layout. And actually being there in person gave us a different perspective on what might have happened.
Oh, let's look at this exit. Yeah, thank you.
Oh wait, this one you can still drive it.
Look, it's in the back too. You see them opening it right now? While there in the warehouse, Susan and I were both struck with the same realization. It would have been so easy for someone to have driven Renee into the Home Depot.
But once he drives in, he probably drives away from the big open stuff.
Yeah, he could drive anywhere.
And he would probably drive away from where
anyone could see.
If you're concerned about someone over on the Yosemite side, people might theoretically be looking in and seeing you, you go here. There's no doors over there. So someone looking straight on the building would not see you here. And there's no door to the back right here.
It's a pretty secluded spot, and you could drive in a little ways, make her walk. You could drive in all the way.
Oh man, he drove in there. It makes so much more sense than anything else.
Home Depots are designed for vehicles to be able to drive inside. And when Renee died, there'd been no doors yet. The back wall of the Home Depot had an open garage entrance that anyone with a car could have driven right through.
I mean, the cops got so hung up on this question of, like, why would Renee have gone here? And they think they're trying to solve the mystery of why Renee walked into the Home Depot.
They're assuming she did it voluntarily.
There's no mystery of why Renee came into the Home Depot construction site. Because she didn't, not voluntarily. She was driven here. I'd bet a lot on it.
You pull her out of the car, she's kicking, screaming, no one would hear.
Yeah.
She loses her shoe, he grabs her, throws her down by the insulation, tries to rape her. She's fighting for her life. He gets frustrated, he fucking chokes her to death.
Then
he panics, he just throws some insulation over, jumps back in the car.
He panics, just leaves. Makes total sense. Whether it was Conway or someone else, it makes total sense. No, we're good, thank you.
Thanks.
And I'd say that would be strange MO, except it kind of matches what he did in 2008 to the 14-year-old victim.
Susan and I were speaking hypothetically here. We were running through possible scenarios about what could have happened and what an unknown perpetrator might have done. But it was hard not to think of Jared Conway as we did so. We knew that in 2008, he'd abducted a girl and driven her into some sort of secluded garage structure. The girl was blindfolded, so she didn't know where it had been. But Conway had parked somewhere, pulled the victim out of his car, and then forced her into a different car, where he kept her overnight.
We need to write to him.
We do. And find out who we killed in Tennessee.
Yeah. All right, let's go back. I could just send a letter now before we meet our next witness.
Let's do it.
All right.
Jared Conway is in prison, so finding him was easy at least. We mailed out a letter asking to speak with him and waited to see what he'd write back. If he wrote back. In the meantime, we had to go meet our next witness.
While in Manteca, we tried to investigate Josh Burrows' story. But nothing we found made us think that Josh had any actual knowledge of what had happened to Renee. There was nothing he said in any of his recorded interviews that was consistent with the crime scene or the known timeline or any established facts. Even his story about Richard, aka Rapper's Delight, hadn't been true. Quite simply, we could find no evidence that Josh Burrows knew anything about Renee's death. And if that's the case, then that means the only remaining evidence against Ty Lopes came from the jailhouse informants who said that Ty had confessed to them. Which is why Jacinda and I were on our ways to a chili restaurant to talk to one of the informants whose testimony had convicted Ty Lopes.
There were actually several would-be jailhouse informants in this case. Most said it was Ty who had confessed to them, though one said he'd overheard a discussion between Ty and Ray Gomes where they incriminated themselves. But the confessions these informants described hearing varied wildly, and none of them really matched the evidence in the case that well. In the end, only 2 informants were permitted to testify. The first was a guy we'll call Bill. Bill testified that while in jail, Ty told him he and his friends had taken Renee to the Home Depot to have sex. But things got out of hand, and Renee started screaming that she had a bladder infection and would call the cops. Bill said that when Ty confessed, he'd explained that's why Ray Gomes had shoved rags down Renee's throat and killed her. Because, quote, "Don't no bitch do me that way." Bill testified that he'd only been a jailhouse informant a couple times before this, but he had known Detective Wells for many years, in a, quote, "professional capacity," meaning Detective Wells had arrested him a lot. We never talked to Bill. We think he's still alive. He'd be about 80 years old now, but we weren't able to get in touch with him, so we couldn't ask him about what he said. But Prosecutor Schultz told the jury that although Bill's story doesn't entirely fit the evidence, we know Ty must have confessed to him, because how else would Bill have known about Renee's bladder infection? Only Ty could have told him that.
The second informant was a guy that we're going to call Mike. Mike testified that while in jail with Ty confessed to killing a girl at either a home base or a Home Depot. Mike didn't know the girl's name. Ty never told him that. The only name Ty ever mentioned was that of Jake Silva. But Ty explained to Mike that he, Jake, and some little Norteño guy had raped and killed Jake's girlfriend, and then a 15-year-old boy had cleaned up all the evidence for them. I was able to find Mike. I gave him a call one night, and he answered. Afterwards, I told Jake about our conversation. I spoke to one of the jailhouse informants that testified against Ty. A guy named... Remember him?
Oh, yeah, hell yeah, I remember him. He testified against Ty?
Wait, you didn't know that?
No, I didn't. Wow.
Wait, you remember him, but you didn't remember him testifying against Ty?
No, I knew there was a couple guys that did or whatever, but I didn't know that was him, specifically him.
Why do you recall him?
Wow. I remember me being cool with him. I was always cool with him. I think we were in the hole in the county jail, and I always remember him being cool.
Jake had known at one point that Mike testified against Ty Lopes. Jake was in the courtroom on one of those occasions. Jake had just forgotten about it. What Jake remembers is that he and Mike met while they were at the county jail together, and that Mike had been a pretty cool guy. Mike remembered Jake too. He asked if I could pass on a message to Jake for him. But he asked, have you talked to Jake? I said, yeah, I can talk to him. And he said, if you talk to him, tell him that I never thought he did it. He wants you to know that he thought you were cool and that he never thought that you'd done this.
Yes, yeah, I told you. We were always cool. I remember him being cool. As soon as you said that name...
Jake may have forgotten about Mike testifying against Ty Lopes, but Mike certainly hasn't forgotten it. When I called and told him what case I was working on, he'd known right away why I wanted to speak to him. He told me, do you know how when you have something in your past, you know it's going to catch up with you one day? This is it for me.
Mike agreed to meet with us on our next trip to California. He didn't want to be recorded, but we made plans to meet him at a Chili's for dinner. On the way there, Susan and I explained to Kevin who we were about to go talk to.
He had gotten up there and told this story about Jake raping her and Ty holding her down and Ty joining in and just all that.
And Ty's in the courtroom while this is happening.
Yeah. Jeez. Well, Jake is too, because the preliminary hearing he did it as well.
So why is Jake like, oh, he's a nice guy?
Because Jake had a massive brain injury and he's forgotten a lot of stuff.
Okay.
Jake remembers the truth. Our conversation with Mike was long and emotional. As we were driving away from the Chili's, we updated Kevin on how it'd gone. So this guy started crying.
Yeah.
And he questioned what he did and what role he played in their convictions.
Sounds like he played a pretty substantial role in their convictions.
I mean, not in Jake's, but in Ty's, yeah. Yeah, he did. Yeah, he said that he always knew it was this big a case and that someone would be calling him one day and there'd be a reckoning, but I think he'd forgotten how big of a reckoning it'd be.
So let's back up. Mike served time with Ty. They were in protective custody. Mm-hmm. And Ty, as we've been told from anyone who's ever met Ty, talked a lot about the case and talked a lot about his innocence and why he was innocent.
Would not shut up about it.
Talked about DNA and the lack of DNA.
Ty was not well liked in the jail. Mike told us that there were several plots on the PC yard to try and get him. And we were like, oh, because, he was charged with rape? And he was like, more just because it was Ty.
Mike told us, I've met a lot of characters in my life, but I've never met one like Ty Lopes. After 23 years, you forget a lot of people, but I'd never forget him. He said while in jail, he really had talked with Ty about his case. Or at least Ty had talked at him about it. That part of Mike's testimony had been true. But Ty hadn't been confessing. He'd been brainstorming ways to prove his innocence.
I asked him, what did Ty told him? What did Ty say to him? And he remembers Ty going on about, can you get DNA from a body? Can you get fingerprints from a body?
I think Ty was hoping there'd be DNA that implicated someone else.
Yeah, I think he was hoping they'd get DNA, yeah.
He wasn't saying it like,
oh my God, I'm gonna
oh
get
my
caught.
God, if they pull a fingerprint from her body, it's gonna be me. He was saying it like, I wonder if they could do that because it would prove it wasn't me.
Mike told us his conversation with Ty had mostly just been Ty talking about how he was innocent and how he was going to prove it somehow. But that is not what Mike testified to in court. So what happened? Why had Mike lied?
And he explained that he had a lot of time, 5 years, and he was offered 7 months if he would testify against some people. He was actually an informant in 3 different cases. Court records show that Mike's deal had not been just about Ty. The terms of the deal required him to testify that 3 different defendants from 3 different murder cases had all confessed to him while he was in the county jail. It's possible the DA's office had also hoped that Mike would testify against a 4th defendant too, because after being on the PC yard with Ty, Mike was transferred to Ad Seg, where Jake was being kept in solitary confinement. Because they were all co-defendants, the San Joaquin County Jail had to keep Jake, Ty, and Ray separate. They couldn't be housed in the same place. So Ray was in the main yard, Ty was in protective custody, and that meant the only place left for Jake was in Ad Seg, that is, in solitary confinement, where he was kept for nearly 2 years. That's how Jake knows Mike. That's why Jake remembers Mike vividly all these years later. Because during those bad days in the hole, during his 2 years in solitary confinement, Jake rarely heard a friendly voice. Only a handful of people were ever nice to him, and Mike was one of them. Mike and Jake could communicate through the vents or through exchanging kites. And Mike would talk to Jake and joke around with him, keep him company, help him make it through the crushing loneliness and Jake's fears of what was to come. So yeah, Jake thought Mike was cool. And Mike recalled Jake fondly too. He liked Jake. He called Jake a scared white boy?
He said he saw Jake and he was a scared white kid. He just crying all the time and just a kid.
Well, he was just a kid.
Yeah. Mike doesn't know if investigators were hoping that he'd testify Jake had confessed to him as well. But Detective Susan Wells did ask Mike about Jake. According to their police report, though, Mike's response had been, "Oh, I rarely ever talked with Silva." So Mike did not testify against Jake. He would serve as an informant at Ty Lopes' trial only. Though Mike was hoping he'd never have to do even that.
So he's assuming maybe that Ty or any of these other people would plea out. He'll never actually have to take the stand and literally point the finger at someone.
Yep.
I mean, that doesn't change the nature of what he's done, but maybe in his mind, at least he's not doing it in a courtroom.
He also has babies of his own at home and a pregnant wife, and
he was told he could go home right now if he did this, and maybe there'd never be consequences.
Sure, he's making a trade. He's making a trade for 5 years of his life to say something.
For 2 of the 3 cases, his bet paid off. He never had to go to trial. For his 3rd bet, he lost. Over a year after he'd been released from jail, he got called up to come testify.
In Ty's case.
Yep. And if he did not, they would sentence him on the original charges and he'd be going to prison for 5 years. So he went ahead and testified.
You know, you said he agreed to testify. The way he explained it didn't sound like he agreed. His hand was forced.
Okay, he agreed. He said it was a deal with the devil. He agreed thinking that maybe he'd never have to pay back one day. He would never need to go to court. And what did he say? For 2 years I'd gotten away with it. And then one day the devil came and got his due. For Mike, the devil had been on the 5th floor of the San Joaquin County Courthouse. That's where investigators would take him, whenever they wanted to talk to him about a case he was helping them on. That's where they'd take him to talk about Ty.
He also said you've got, like, how many? 4, 5 white men in suits.
Yeah.
He's being
got
brought
5
to
white
their
men in
offices
suits telling you something happened.
saying, we
Or you
know
would
this
doubt it.
guy is guilty and we know he's talking to you and we can help you get out and you're going to do this. Right?
Mike described to us what it had been like, sitting there in that conference room on the 5th floor, him in his orange jumpsuit, surrounded by detectives and prosecutors and DA investigators, all of them telling him, we know Ty talks a lot in the yard. He's talking to everyone. Don't you dare lie to us and say he's not talking to you too. We know he's talking to you, so what's he saying? For a lot of reasons, it had seemed to Mike that telling them a story about how Ty had confessed to him was the easy path forward. We asked Mike, but how did you know what story to make up? It wasn't easy, he told us. When you've got all those people in suits telling you something could have happened, and maybe it went this way, maybe it went that way, it confuses the shit out of you. We asked if Mike thought that the investigators had coached him into testifying the way he did. I can't say I was coached, he said. I would say it's more like they helped me create a story. I told them what I knew, they told me what they knew, and so on and so on. Mike told us one of the things that he had known, even before going up to the 5th floor, was that investigators believed Jake Silva and Ty Lopes had committed the crime together. He also told us that he hadn't even realized that Ty and Jake were co-defendants because, Ty talked about his case, but Ty wasn't using names. But then one day, a CEO, a corrections officer, who looked like Butthead from Beavis and Butthead, slid a news article under his door that talked about how Jake and Ty were co-defendants. So that's how he learned who Ty's co-defendant was. Jake's and Ty's pictures had been there side by side on the front page of the paper. That's how Mike found out Jake was Ty's co-defendant. Neither Jake nor Ty ever mentioned that to him. So that's part of the story that Mike already knew himself. And the prosecutors had helped him from there by letting him know that Ty Lopes had a thing for Jake's girlfriend, and that this had been a problem for Jake. And so on and so on. I don't think that Mike or the other jailhouse informants were directly coached by investigators. Not in the sense that they were told what to say and made to parrot it back. In fact, I'm confident that is not what happened. The investigators could not have been giving these informants too much help, or else these informant stories would have been a hell of a lot better. According to Mike, though, investigators did give them some help. Or at least they had tried to help him out. When they bring him up to the 5th floor, which is where they brought people like this to talk to the DA's office, they would leave their folder of stuff from Renee's case with her picture, like her school picture on the outside. But it was open, so you could, just glance in and see crime scene photos in the folder. And he talked about seeing her body in the insulation. So that's how he'd known where the body was, because the photos were left there for him to look at. Mike told us that when he was up there on the 5th floor to talk about Ty Lopes, sometimes all the men in suits and ties would step out and leave him there alone in the room, with an open folder containing the case file. And from the way this was done, Mike understood he was being given permission, or maybe even an instruction, to read through the file. We have no way to confirm what Mike told us. We have never heard back from Sousa or Wells or Prosecutor Schultz, so we can't ask them about it. But what Mike says happened makes sense, because it explains why Mike's story got some oddly specific details correct, but other things that he said were just completely wrong. And it explains why Mike wasn't able to give the names of anyone else involved in the story. Mike didn't even know Renee's name. Because what investigators hadn't known is that Mike didn't know how to read. He'd been left alone with the police reports, but he had no way of knowing what those reports said. The case file wasn't totally useless to Mike. It had also contained photos, which gave him some useful info to go on. That's how he'd known, for example, about the girl's body being found covered in insulation. But today, the thing Mike remembers the most about that case file isn't the crime scene photos. It's a school photo of Renee, alive and smiling, that was affixed to the outside of the folder. I always saw that picture, Mike told us. They kept wanting me to look at that picture, every time. It was as if they were trying to tell him, help us get the monsters that killed this poor girl.
He did say he never thought Jake had anything to do with it.
Yeah.
But
But he thought Ty had something to do with it?
Well, he says now, looking back and being older and wiser and knowing, how he was played, he doesn't think Ty had anything to do with it either.
When I talked to him on the phone, he was like adamant from the get-go. He's like, I never thought Jake had anything to do with that stuff. But he's like, but yeah, but Ty did that stuff. Ty did it. And today he was like, I've been thinking about it. I'm like, Ty wasn't the kind of guy to do that shit.
But even back then, Mike told us, he never for a minute thought Jake Silva had been involved in any of it. I never implicated him, he insisted to us. And Mike is sort of correct in that he never testified against Jake. But he testified against Ty and told Ty's jury that Ty told him that Jake was the one who raped and killed his girlfriend.
So he's like, I definitely never implicated Jake. And at some point, I brought out his trial transcript, and I'm like, you actually did, though. You actually said that Jake was raping Renee, and Ty helped hold her arms down.
What?
Yeah.
And he didn't doubt me for a second, but he also didn't remember it.
He said, if it's there, I must have said it. But
yeah.
I did not remember saying it.
Maybe he doesn't want to remember it?
I think that, too.
I think, for the most part, Mike really had forgotten the story he made up all those years ago. After all, it was just a story. But I think he'd wanted to believe he hadn't falsely accused someone he'd known in his heart was actually innocent. But he had. Mike was emotional throughout our conversation. He was very aware of the wrong he had done, and that for Ty, it was a wrong that can't ever be undone. Though, he told us there had been repercussions for him too, nearly fatal ones.
He had a choice, and there were consequences, because once he got out, he was out for a while, then the trial happens, and the, other gang guys trying to murder him. And they shot him, but he lived.
I still like to make sure that he actually got shot.
He showed us the gunshot wounds, so yeah.
3.
He got shot for something. Mike had been an active gang member, a real gang, not like Grim Crew. And for the people Mike ran with, it was irrelevant who he testified against. When they found out he was a jailhouse informant, they weren't going to let it go. There was a drive-by. Mike got shot up pretty bad, but they'd missed any vital organs. He'd lived. Now, for obvious reasons, fact-checking Mike's claim here that back in 2002 he'd been shot and nearly killed because people found out he was an informant against Ty Lopes isn't really possible. So consider this claim unverified. But I believed him. It's been a long time since then, and Mike lives a different kind of life now. But still, speaking to us about what happened, acknowledging his role as an informant, could still have real personal consequences for him. But he talked to us anyway. Because Mike always knew that one day, someone like me would be calling him. And when I finally did, he decided it was time to come clean about the deal he'd made with the men in suits and ties on the courthouse's 5th floor.
Next week on Proof.
Last time I saw him, Ray was packing. He was catching a ride from somebody and he was going home. And I gave him a hug and that was that.
Can I just go on the record and say that Susan is the worst stakeout partner?
Can I just say that Jacinda is the worst stakeout partner in history? How close were you and Robbie back then?
Oh, we were best friends. We did everything. We skated together. We did everything together. Yeah, I haven't heard from him in years.
Okay, so I just got to the office, and there are 2 letters here from Jared Conway.
You've been listening to Proof, a podcast by Red Marble Media in association with Glassbox Media. We'll be back next week with episode 11. Send us your questions and comments at proofcrimepod@gmail.com. We'll respond during our bonus episodes, Proof Sidebar, on Thursdays. Kevin Fitzpatrick is our executive producer. Our webmaster is Clayton Brawley. And our theme music is by Ramiro Marquez. Audio production for this episode is by George Panos, Michael Ulatowski, and Steve Rentos. Our archivist is Amory Davis. Our social media manager is Skylar Park. And thank you to our sponsors who make this podcast possible. Check out the show notes for special sponsor deals. And follow us everywhere with the handle @ProofCrimePod and on our website, proofcrimepod.com.
And lastly, a note to our listeners. If you have any information related to this case, we'd love to speak to you, no matter how small a detail it may seem. It just might be more important than you realize. You can reach us by email or leave us a voicemail at 929-267-3172.
That's all for this week. Thanks so much for listening.